Tanya, the third chapter of the Holy Tanya, the Tanya Kadisha, written by Shneur Zalman of Liadi. We started this class on Chol Hamoed Sukkos. For those who were here, we started it outside on the balcony in the sukkah, for those who remember. And we are now rapidly, tonight is Erev Pesach, so we have established the rate of this class that we can now establish, which is we did the introduction and 2 chapters in 6 months. So that means we do about 3 chapters in half a year, 6 chapters a year. That's our rate. Our rate is now established. For those who are curious, the first chapter of Tanya, the first chapter of the Holy Tanya is concerned with the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul. Every Jew has an animal soul which derives from Klippas Nega, which is the translucent Klippa, which in other words means every Jew has a soul which derives from neutral objective reality. It's a creation like any other. Its spiritual root is I am. It has a spiritual root as an independent being from God. The second chapter of Tanya, which we just concluded recently, discusses the Jew's godly soul. The second soul of a Jew, which is in the immortal words of the Alter Rebbe, is a chelek eleika mimal mamish, is a piece of God above, or a part of God above, literally. We spent a long chapter discussing what that means, what it means to be a piece of, what it means that the soul is no longer, has become separate from God, but simultaneously is not separate from God at all, but rather totally united with Him in an irrevocable, unchanging, and unchangeable way. That the soul, the godly soul's connection with God is absolutely inherent, indelible, and unchanging. It's to separate a godly soul from God is like separating a thing from itself. It's impossible. A Jew does not want and cannot be separated from godliness, at least in their godly soul. So the first chapter is the animal soul. What is the animal soul is really the question the first chapter answers. What is the godly soul is the topic of the second chapter. We now have 6 chapters, which at our current rate means we have a year ahead of us, starting now, in which you have 3 chapters. Chapter 3, 4, and 5 is devoted to the structure, faculties, actions, and behavior of the godly soul, of the Nefesh Elokis. So these 3 chapters, 3, 4, and 5, are devoted to the nature and the detailed nature, getting into the structure, behavior, intellect, emotions, thought, speech, and action of the godly soul. And then chapter 6 through 8 does the same with the animal soul, what the animal soul does, its structure, nature, thought, speech, action, and behavior. Then in chapter 9 is when we really go back to start to go back to the questions we asked in chapter 1, which all have to do with the nature of tzaddik, benani, rasha, right? Understanding what it means for when a person is righteous or an intermediate man or a wicked man in terms of what Judaism expects and the way that a Jew behaves, and we go further with the Alter Rebbe's whole discussion of how a Jew is to live their life, what the goal of a Jewish life is, etc., etc. So we are still, especially the first 8 chapters, but really in a way the first 12 chapters is really all information, right? As we discussed earlier at some point in one of our classes, the Alter Rebbe is opening the Tanya by building his whole worldview, which is really his view of the inner dynamics, the inner spiritual and metaphysical and existential dynamics of a Jew from the ground up, because he has to give you that whole worldview to even have the language, to even have the map in which we can move forward and try and do something with it, so to speak, and approach practical questions and how to live our life day to day and how to live our life in a broader sense, etc. So that's where we are in the broader stream of Tanya. Now let's zoom in, and we're going to discuss chapter 3. Chapter 3 is about the faculties of the godly soul. The 10 faculties, as we're going to see, of the godly soul, which the Alter Rebbe actually says comprise the godly soul, although we'll see that, as with many things in Tanya, it's very terse, and you have to understand that there's more to that than meets the eye, because the soul transcends any one of its faculties or any set of its faculties, which is why we already were introduced to the soul in the second chapter before we get into any details about it, because in Chassidus, the unified, single essential whole, the self of a thing, is always beyond its various parts and aspects, which are only secondary or somewhat external to the thing. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves here. So we'll get into all of that in much more detail, I'm sure, later. So that is the general approach we have now. What did we discuss in a recent class? I'll ask you a question that we answered in a recent class. The question is, if we've already said that the godly soul is literally a piece of God above, why would its faculties, structure, and behavior interest us? Because after all, you can't get any better, you can't get any closer to God than being a piece of God above, right? You could say we're learning all these things for practical reasons, right? Because for pragmatic reasons. However, functionally, none of that pragmatism can improve on, as we just emphasized a couple of minutes ago, none of the behavior it's going to describe can improve on a soul that is literally a piece of God, right? So why even bother? Really, in a way, the Tanya should end after the second chapter, because the answer is, what do I have to do to get closer to God? The answer should be, you're already there, your soul's already a piece of God, and that's it. Geendigt, as we say in Yiddish, it's over. All right? Everyone's assuming this question is rhetorical, which is a relief. So the answer to this question is, as we discussed in a recent class, that at the level of the essential, at the level of what the godly soul is, it is of course true that there is no action that can improve on that, and there is no action which can bring you closer to God. And in fact, this whole perspective where you've already won and you're already there and the book should end is in some sense true. It's true at the essential level. However, the twist is, and the reason why we're here in this world, and the godly soul is shackled and tied at the ankle to an animal soul and a body and all of these other things, is because God does not give us a godly soul just so that we can be a godly soul. There's more to do. In other words, the pragmatic question enters into it not because through pragmatic actions and behaviors of the godly soul, as we're going to discuss in chapter 4, you have mitzvahs, and in chapter 5 you have Torah, not because any of these behaviors or actions can fundamentally improve on the nature of the godly soul. That's not why we have any of these things. They can't bring you any closer to God than you fundamentally are in your godly soul already. The reason why we have these things is because we need not just to be close to God, but to bring that into expression and into action. Or, to put it all in very simple words, we're here on a mission. We're not just here to be a godly soul. If the job was just to be a godly soul, then you would never have been born. That's not why people are born. You're not born to be a godly soul. That's not why Jews are here. Jews are not here to be one with God, even though they are, right? So in a way, as part of students of Chassidus and students of the Tanya, we have to gain a little bit, or begin to gain a little bit of this, it's hard to put it into words exactly, a little bit of an eye towards these, I guess what you would call Chassidic ironies, in the sense of the most profound and the deepest thing is the thing that is also the most simple, and the thing that is also least easy to talk about, and the thing that cannot be changed. So in a sense, it just passes in chapter 2, and there's nothing left to say about it. Your soul is a piece of God. Nothing you can do can detract from that or add to that. And so that's that, even though it's the most profound fact you could possibly say about the godly soul, in a strange way, because we are not discussing it as simple selves, but discussing it at the level of intellect here at Chabad of Cobb as in bodies and with rational minds and animal souls and all of our other baggage, right? That for that very reason, this fact actually has to go, in some sense, relatively gently. It has to sort of pass us by. And in fact, as we'll see later in Tanya, Alter Rebbe explicitly says that it is in fact because we are so deeply insensitive to such things that we are in fact useful. That's actually part of our purpose. One of the reasons why God prefers human beings to angels is because angels get excited about things like that, whereas us, we're too coarse and distant and stupid to really appreciate it. So it's which is a good thing, because God needs us to do things rather than just to enjoy our inherent divine nature all day long. But all of that can be discussed later. I would like to begin to read the Gimmel of the Tanya. For those who have the English Hebrew, it is on page Zion, where chapter 3 starts, and in the English it is on page 10, in the simple Hebrew English translation that we use here. Chapter 3. Today's class and the beginning of chapter 3 are very Kabbalistic, so it's a pity that some of our regulars are already on away for Pesach, who would have enjoyed that very much. And hopefully they can watch the recording. Anyway, Parag Gimmel, chapter 3. Says the Heilige Tanya, the Tanya Kadisha, the holy words of the Alter Rebbe. V'hinei, and behold, kol b'chino madrega mishalosh elu nefesh ruach neshama, every aspect and level of these three levels of the godly soul we were discussing in the previous chapter, called nefesh, ruach, and neshama, which are three words that all translate as soul. So there's not much I can do for you there, but we'll get into that in a second. Klula me'eser bechinos is itself comprised of 10 aspects, okay? So each of the three levels of the godly soul, which we were speaking about at the end of chapter 2, is itself comprised of 10 levels. Now, let's take it one piece at a time. Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama. We've spoken about this before. We'll continue to flesh out this picture as we go through in our studies of Tanya. The Kabbalah says that there's 5 levels to the soul, okay? In ascending order. At some point, I'll bring in a whiteboard and draw some pretty pictures for everyone, such as much as I can, as much as such a thing is possible. But you have Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, that's in ascending order, okay? These are all terms for soul that are found in Scripture. The Kabbalah gives you the ordering and the nature of the levels or types of soul, because we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so you have the ascending levels. Let's do the 5 levels first. You have Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama is 3. Those are the 3 main ones we'll be discussing here, at least at the beginning of Tanya. Then you have 2 higher levels, which are called Chaya and Yechida, all of which are words for the soul. Okay, everything in Kabbalah is not. That's actually not true. Take a step back. Many things in Kabbalah, when we're talking about different levels in an orderly structure in Kabbalah, as opposed to what you would call an infinite or a simple structure, which is something else, or it's not even a structure, an infinite or simple relationship. But when you're talking about orderly levels, in Kabbalah, the various spiritual levels, right? Generally speaking, within the 4 worlds, which we've already discussed and we'll talk about more, there's a concept called Hiscalolus. Hiscalolus means, the best translation of Hiscalolus is inter-inclusion, which means that unlike in higher places where the infinitude of God is expressed in simplicity, which is the true infinitude of God, where things don't have parts but are simple, utterly metaphysically simple, right? The infinitude of God within finitude, in other words, within the worlds, within structures and limited things, is expressed through Hiscalolus, is expressed through inter-inclusion, which means that rather than simple infinity, you have an infinite complexity in which everything is united with and part of and integrated with everything else. Right? I once called this balance, and my Chassidus teacher became very upset because he said, in general, and he knows everything, just about. He says balance is an Eastern term, so he calls it integration. And there's a subtle difference, and I'll give you his email address. You could email him to find out what the difference is. So the inter-inclusion or integration, right, means. I actually know what the difference is. That was just a joke, but he made sure I knew. But the inter-inclusion of things means that everything in our reality is part of everything else, right? The classic example, which is coming up right now on the second day of Pesach, is we're going to count the Omer, and everybody knows who follows the Chabad Siddur and says the Chabad Tefillah for the counting of the Omer knows that every day of the Omer corresponds to a different one of the 49 inter-included emotional traits, right? So in other words, you have kindness, but kindness is the whole first week. Then within kindness, each day of the whole first week, you have kindness within kindness, severity within kindness, right? Beauty within kindness. Then the second week is the week of severity, but in severity you have all of them. You have kindness within severity, severity within severity, chesed sheba gvura, gvura sheba gvura, right? So in other words, the 7, it's actually 7 times 7, right? And the fact is that is just the zoomed out version, but as of course you must know, the Kabbalah says that you can zoom in on this infinitely, right? There's no limit, right? There's chesed sheba gvura sheba chesed sheba gvura sheba chesed, right? And it just multiplies with itself infinitely, and in fact, this multiplication of the Sefiros, which this is actually germane to our chapter, this multiplication of the divine traits or the divine levels, one with the other, is how we arrive at the qualitative infinite multiplicity of our universe, right? In other words, the distinctions qualitatively between all things, right? Why this table is made of wood, and wood has a certain color, and a certain weight, and a certain density, and certain traits, like it's easily burned by fire, for example, or whatever it is, right? That's all determined by an inter-inclusion of Sefiros, right? When we learned the second part of Tanya, we said this in a different way. We said that it had to do with the combinations of letters and the process of the words. This is, anyone remember this? The combinations of the letters, the switching of the letters into gematrias, right? It's exactly the same concept. It's just using different language, right? As actually we're going to see today, God willing, the letters and the divine traits are all connected. It's all the general, under the same general rubric in the Kabbalah. Why is all this relevant to the discussion of the levels of the soul, which I still have not forgot? Because here, when we talk about these 3 levels of the soul, the Alter Rebbe could be talking about any number of things, and it's not clear which one he's talking about, right? Because when you talk about nefesh, ruach, and neshama, right? Set aside chaya and yechida, the 2 higher levels of the soul for now. Let's not overcomplicate. You have the 3 lower levels of the soul. The 3 lower levels of the soul in Kabbalah generally correspond to nefesh, means the actions of a person, or broadly what a person does. You have ruach, which corresponds to the emotions, right? And you have neshama, which corresponds to the intellect, okay, the mind. However, clearly what we are talking about is not any one of these particular traits. We're talking about either different people or different generations over time, or different times in a person's life. It could be any of those or all of them, probably all of them, right? Because the general gist is like this, and this is really a side point, so if I explain it poorly, don't let it hold you up too much for the chapter, because this is really a relatively minor point here, I feel free to say. When we talk about a soul in general, we're talking about vitality. It's chayos, right? It's a divine vitality. It's a divine life force. We're talking about the godly soul in this chapter, right? So, when we say nefesh, ruach, and neshama, what we mean is that there's different ways in which at the simplest level, it's talking about different people, I believe, which means there's different ways in which different people are alive, right? For example, one person can have a godly soul where their whole life and their whole excitement is in the world of the mind, right? Such a person, of course, also has emotions and actions. But where they do emotions, they do actions, and they feel emotions, but where do they feel themselves to really live? They live all in the world of the intellect. That's what excites them. That's where their passion comes out. You can see it. You can see that when they're dealing with emotions and actions, their life doesn't come out. But when they deal with ideas, that's where they're alive. Other people, so that's someone who's a neshama, right? Their vitality is primarily in the intellect. Then you have a person who their life is a life of emotions, right? Intellect is not really their thing. Actions matter less to them. It's all about what's in the heart. That's a ruach soul. And then you have a nefesh soul where actually the real passion and the real vitality is in action. It's all in what's done rather than in the thought or in the emotions. And these are all different levels that the godly soul can come down to. In other words, the godly soul in its descent into this reality, which was discussed a lot in the previous chapter, which is where these terms first arose, right? It gains these different traits as it comes down into this reality through all the world, as we discussed in chapter 2. So that's why different people get their vitality in different ways. That's primarily what the Alter Rebbe means here with Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama. The different types of godly soul in there, and the reason there are different types is because they descend in different ways from the source where they're all the same and all identical, as we discussed in chapter 2. Says the Alter Rebbe, so every godly soul, in short, is what we're reading it now. That's why I said it doesn't matter so much to the flow of the chapter, because we're going to read this very simply as each person's godly soul has 10 bechinos. Has 10 aspects. I'm translating as aspects. I'm curious how they translate. They say 10 faculties. All right. They're already going to faculties because they know that's what they are. But bechina is a broader term, which means aspects. When we say bechina in Chassidus, this is a term of art. In other words, this is a word used very precisely. It has a philosophical meaning in Chassidus. But the meaning of bechina is something like, I'm still studying it myself, one of the most common words in the whole of Chassidus. Bechina means something like an aspect of an indivisible and unified whole that from the outside and for purposes of study, we are going to treat as an independent thing. I'll say that again. A bechina, or an aspect. The reason why the Alter Rebbe is using the word aspect rather than part, level, you could use any other things, extension, organ, you could use all sorts of words for the term. The reason we're calling it 10 aspects is because a bechina, when you talk about something has 10 bechinas, you mean that you leave room to say that fundamentally the thing could actually be one, right? I'm not saying that there's actually 10 things, 10 different things, right? The thing may be one, but from outside of the thing and below the thing, and for purposes of discussion, we are going to pick them out. But we have to remember always, it's very important in Chassidus in general, not to get too coarse and physical with our descriptions. We are going to treat them as if they are actually 10 things, and you could actually pick it out and say this is one thing and this is another. When in reality it may not be the case. In reality, it's very likely that these 10 are actually all one. They're not really 10, but we are picking it out. And part of the reason why they're one is what we discussed earlier, which is Hiscalolus, is the way they're all inter-included in one another. So they're not really separable, but that's on one foot what that means. So, to recap the sentence now in full translation, chapter 3 begins, the Alter Rebbe says, every godly soul has 10 aspects, has 10 qualities to its being that we're going to treat as 10, even though you must remember that not necessarily if you went into the soul with a submersible, if you went on Magic School Bus into the neshama, you wouldn't necessarily see 10 different things. Yeah, is everyone with me so far? General groans of assent? I'll take it. Continues the Holy Alter Rebbe, Keneged, these 10 aspects of the soul, these 10 faculties correspond to, they're Keneged, they correspond to Eser Sefiros Elyonos, 10 supernal or divine Sefiros. Sefiros is an untranslatable word. And yet another one. This chapter is going to be like that, unfortunately. There's the 10 faculties of the soul correspond to 10 Sefiros. We spoke about the Sefiros when we spoke about the 4 worlds briefly. I said that every one of the 4 spiritual worlds has 10 Sefiros, which is like the DNA or the core of that world and defines the nature of that spiritual world. Yes? But now that we're encountering it in its appropriate place, I would actually like to take a step back, okay? To reorient us so that some of the ideas hopefully go in a little bit more easily. Because the beginning here is going to be very Kabbalistic of this chapter, which means, what I mean by Kabbalistic is lots of terms that are difficult to translate or have no translation. That's really what I mean. So listen, we'll try and do this with speaking in common language as easily as possible. They say about the Rebbe's older brother, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's older brother, one of the stories they tell about him, of blessed memory, is that he could explain all the Kabbalistic levels up to, I think it was up through Bria, which is the second highest world. He could explain all of them without using any Hebrew terms whatsoever. That's what they say about him. He could explain it all in simple language that anyone could understand, up to that level. So they say. More could be said about that, but whatever. Okay. In chapter 2, when we talked about the godly soul, right? The essence of the godly soul, the divine self, God saying, I am, right? We discussed how the entire function of the godly soul, really, why have a godly soul, right? Well, what's it necessary for? And we explain that the whole idea is, if you think of God facing the world or facing a human being, right? One face facing down, one face facing upward, so to speak, right? We're already hopelessly lost because we're using physical metaphors, but we'll stick with it anyway, because we do this in Chassidus all the time. You have to be comfortable with metaphors that you are not taking at face value, right? Face value is a pun, they're facing each other. Anyway, so God is facing the human being, and the human being is facing God. The whole purpose of the godly soul, or the function of the godly soul, so to speak, if you could say such a thing as a function, is that the reason a Jew has an nefesh elokis, a godly soul, is because the godly soul is a back door, was the word we used, the word I preferred to use in the second chapter. The godly soul means that there is no communicative relationship necessary between God and the human being. In other words, when you communicate, I'm communicating with you right now, right? People who know computer science will know well. The message, because the concept in computer science comes from all communication, right? The message has to come through many, many layers. It's coming from my mind. It's being compressed into language. That language is then put into speech, which is in a particular spoken language, which is English, which then has to come over the air, which is an imperfect medium, and sometimes it gets lost or garbled depending on what's going on. Then it has to come to your end, and at your end, you have to take this thing, which has mysteriously and somewhat miraculously come over, and somehow you make sense of it and understand somehow what's being discussed, and in a way that is truly mysterious, by the way. And I'm not even saying that as a chassid. I mean, literally, scientifically, it's very mysterious how this whole thing is possible, how communication through language is possible. All communication is like this. The whole need for communication. Who do I need to talk to? Why do I need to talk to you right now? The answer is simple. I need to talk to you because you're not me. If you were me, there'd be no need for communication. One does not communicate with oneself if one is healthy. One communicates with others. The whole need for communication is because we're not, the word is, we're not immediate to each other. Immediate in the literal sense of the word. We're not immediate. In other words, we have a medium. Immediate means there's no medium. We don't need a third thing that is not me and you to communicate across, right? Rather, we're immediate. We're direct, right? This is the famous, in different words, in a slightly different way, this is the famous concept that it says in Jewish philosophy, I believe from Rabbi Yosef Albo, although in this class I've previously said Rav Sajagan, and I should really find out one of these days who actually said it, but they said, the famous statement from Jewish philosophy is, Iliyadaisev hayisiv, if I knew him, I would be him, right? Which was said about God, but is true about anyone. If I really knew them, right? If there was no need for communication, if there was no ignorance, that means fundamentally we would be the same person. So when God faces a human being, we face a fundamental problem. The problem is that we're not immediate, right? God is infinite, the human being is finite. This gap cannot be crossed by communication through a medium, because there is no such thing as a medium, as a third party which has one leg in the infinite and one leg in the finite. Not really. Right? Now you could argue this, and it's much more complicated than I'm saying, but fundamentally, let's put it this way, unless God makes it otherwise, right? By nature, that way we can clear all the complications away. By nature, unless God makes it otherwise, there is no way for the finite to reach the infinite through a medium of communication, because a medium, just like we are both now in the same room and in the same air, and if one of us was not exposed to this air with our ears or our mouth, we would be unable to communicate. We need the medium to connect us, to communicate, because we're two separate things, but somehow the message, the signal has to get from me to you, right? In whatever the medium is. So too, God in the creation, but God in the communication, it's inconceivable what the medium would be that could make the communication. We discussed all this previously. I hope this is something that people vaguely remember. We discussed this in chapter 2. The function of the godly soul is that the Jew and God actually are immediate. That's the function of the godly soul. The function of the godly soul is that because the godly soul is literally a piece of God, right? This whole picture is not technically the whole truth. This whole picture is what's apparently true. You have an infinite God, a finite creation, and they have to communicate somehow like this. But in actuality, if you dig deep into the creation, down here, into the Jew, in this case, you would find that the Jew on the inside is actually, if I could draw, it would be useful, because I would draw you some weird pictures to illustrate how I see it in my head. The Jew is you know, like how those map projections curve around the edge, when they have the round map projection, you know what I'm talking about? Where the lines of latitude and longitude all bend out to the circle, you know what I'm talking about, vaguely? I'll find a picture sometime. The Jew on the inside is like that. The Jew on the inside has a godly soul, and the godly soul is not actually of the human being. It's not actually a human reality. It's actually a divine reality that came around the outside and has somehow ended up in here, if you understand what I'm saying. In other words, this way, you have an insurmountable challenge, right? But in fact, this is not the only connection God has with the Jew. God and the Jew have a connection from the outside. There's a back door. They have a connection outside of this, the usual painting, because a Jew is not really a creation, as we said in chapter 2, at least not in their godly soul. The godly soul is not a creation. It's literally a piece of God. God has entered the creation, so to speak, as his, all the metaphors that we used in chapter 2 of Tanya. He breathed from his deepest depth, right? Or his son came from the deepest place of the Father, right? Which are all metaphors to describe how the godly soul of a Jew enters this reality. So there's backdoor communication. Now, having established this very weird, admittedly, mystical approach to the godly soul, because mysticism brain is the easiest brain with which I understand Chassidus anyway. The third chapter is just adding another layer to this picture. That is the initial picture. The godly soul is a piece of God, and so it's immediate to God. Even though it's been put inside of a body and an animal soul, which make it appear like it's down here, right? It's not actually down here. It's actually still a piece of God in a way that can never be changed. The soul, we're now saying, the godly soul, has 10 faculties, right? Where do those 10 faculties derive from? They derive from the 10 Sefiros. In other words, in the core of the Jew who's down here in this world, there's that piece of God. But what about when you move out from the core, right? I understand that the outer wrapper, where it looks like a regular creation, you're going to have animal soul and body, and that's what makes something a finite creation in this world. But the godly soul is not just that core, which is a piece of God. It also has a structure. That's what it is at essence, right? But there's how it is in the world. There's how it relates to and how it is in relation to other things, right? In that aspect, it has 10 faculties. And where do those 10 faculties come from? They come from not from the core of godliness, which is absolutely simple, but how God relates to realities outside of himself. So in other words, the point is, it's exactly and perfectly logical, parallel structures, right? If the Jew is facing God, you have the two essences which are connected only by back door, right? Then you have the next layer, or the next moving away from the perfect and simple self-contained self into expression, into external relation. You have the 10 Sefiros, which we'll discuss in a second, on God's end. And you have the 10 faculties of the soul on the godly soul's end. And the two perfectly parallel one another. In other words, you could say a general principle: when something that is divine and simple is now standing in relation to other beings, how does it do it? It does it with 10 aspects. There's 10 aspects to this relationship, and the two things are absolutely parallel, and one derives from the other. In other words, where does the godly soul's 10 faculties come from? They come directly from the 10 divine Sefiros. Now, does everyone understand that rant? Okay. New paragraph. What are the 10 Sefiros, right? Let's do the crash course on that very briefly, right? When we say that God has 10 ways of relating, right? Once upon a time, this is the Kabbalistic story of creation, right? You have a biblical story of creation about God saying, "Let there be light," and there was light, which of course is also Kabbalistic, but in a different way. Then you have the Kabbalistic story of creation, which are actually talking about not exactly the same topic, by the way, which is why there's two of them. If they were talking about the same topic, there would really only be one, but they're actually talking about two different things. There's a Kabbalistic story of creation. The Kabbalistic story of creation, very roughly, we've told it in this class before, it goes like this. Once upon a time, there existed only God and his name, which already raises a million questions, I understand. However, God and his name are two different ways of describing the Creator himself and what's called the Ein Sof, which we normally call his infinite light, which has also always existed, and in that sense is primordial, although it is not primordial in the sense of being absolutely necessary and not contingent, because it's contingent on God, for the philosophers who are listening or here. The divine light, because of the nature of what we mean by light, by that term in Kabbalah, about which there are many, many pages in Chassidus, is the fullness of God's being and contains the ability to do anything that God can do, even though it itself is not God. Because it's the divine light. It's the pure, authentic expression of all that God is. Shleimusa de Kula, the perfection of all, right? The wholeness or the fullness of all. So once upon a time, these were the only two things that existed, and of course, they weren't really two things, they were really absolutely one thing in a way that's actually beyond comprehension. Then, God decided to create the world. The first act of creation is called Tzimtzum Harishon, the first Tzimtzum, in which God totally concealed his light. He totally concealed his infinite being. And all that was left over was the void, the empty space, the remnant and the void, translating Kabbalistic terms. Into this emptiness, God shone a single ray of the original light. A ray or a vector of the original light went into this empty void. And that ray, which is called the Kav, then in its descent, a ray giving you the implicit distinction between its source and its destination, which is the whole difference between the Kav and the Igul in Kabbalah, that the original infinite light had no directionality. Now you have a ray which has directionality. That's what it means, a ray or a vector, right? So as it therefore descends, because now something can descend, because it's not a circle, it's a line. A circle can't descend, but a line can descend. This is why people think that Kabbalists are crazy, right? Because when you speak it in simple English, you need to study it, right? As the line comes down, as the vector of the divine light descends and becomes lower and lower through a very long and complex process as described in Kabbalah, there emerges something called the world of Atlus. The world of Atlus we discussed in chapter 2. The world of Atlus is the world of emanation, right? Which we discussed is a totally divine spiritual reality, totally one with God. In this world of Atlus, all of a sudden, for the first time, really, in a proper way, although this itself is more complicated, for the first time, you have 10 separate, qualitatively different divine traits, divine qualities. In other words, you have something called chesed and gvura, for example. You have the divine kindness and the divine discipline or severity. Atzilus is the first time where these two things are qualitatively distinct one from the other. In other words, kindness is kindness, severity is severity, right? I'm massively oversimplifying, just keep in mind. So, if you could actually go to this world and see these 10 Sefiros, so these 10 modes of divine expression, I think we've spoken about this before as well, you would not recognize them by their names. In other words, we're talking about things that are really, really at the edge of human comprehension. If you saw the divine kindness versus the divine anti-kindness in the world of Atzilus, you would not know which one was which, first of all. The names that we give to them because they are the ultimate source of these things as we understand them, but not because they exist there in that way. Number two, you would not perceive them as two separate things because they're only bechinos, they're only aspects. All the Sefiros are actually one. So even though I just said it's the first place you have 10 distinct qualities, it's 10 distinct qualities as they're united in an absolute unity. Number three, you would see each quality is absolutely infinite. In other words, the kindness of Atzilus is absolute infinite kindness. The severity is absolute infinite severity. These are expressions without end. The reason why they're significant is because they are nevertheless still 10 different qualities. These 10 divine qualities, right, as with everything else just about that exist as souls and bodies. There exists in Atzilus these 10 Sefiros. Let me backtrack for a second, maybe help ground all of this, which I understand is very in the air for you at the moment. The Torah talks about if you talk about the chariot of Yechezkel, right, the chariot of Ezekiel, the Maaseh Merkava, which is the basis for much of Kabbalah, right, the vision that Ezekiel has of a divine chariot. It says at the end of the vision, near the end of the vision, that Ezekiel saw sitting on a throne on the chariot the form of a man, right? The form of the man, in other words, in Judaism, in Yiddishkeit, the divine body, so to speak, the body of God, which of course you have to understand, we immediately caveat, and you understand we mean this, which should already be clear, in an incredibly non-literal sense, right? The body of God, as described in the Torah, right, are the 10 Sefiros of Atlus. We read this on Erev Shabbos in the synagogue, right? We read it in the Pasach Eliyahu. It says, Chesed Zer Yemina, Gvura Dra Smola, right? Chesed is his right arm, Gvura is his left arm, right? The whole body, the human form, when we say man is created in the image of God, in the form of man, right, the human body, which itself reflects the human soul, as our chapter is discussing, which also has these 10 aspects, right, all reflect this divine expression, right? And that's what Kabbalah would tell you when it talks about God's body and the actions or motions of God's body. Kabbalah would tell you it all has to do with the Sefiros, right? So for example, when it says that the Jews, when it says God descended to judge Sodom, to judge Sodom, right? Which is one of the original and early bodily descriptions of God in the Torah, when it says God descends to judge Sodom, that is understood Kabbalistically to be a shift in, I believe if I recall correctly, it was from Chesed to Gvura, or maybe in Das, it is a change in the manifestation of the Sefiros. In other words, when you talk about the divine body in the Torah, Kabbalah would tell you you're talking about the 10 Sefiros. You're talking about the 10 modes of divine expression. Does this mean God forbid, has a body? On the contrary, it does not, because the entire idea of the world of Atlus is that it actually has no reality outside of the simplicity of God. Despite everything that I've told you, and this is why you can't really do this on one foot, and there's thousands of pages about Atlus in the discourses of Chabad, right, about the Sefiros and their nature. Ultimately, none of this is in any way, none of the 10 aspects of Atlus in any way is in contradiction to the absolute simplicity of God, right? You have to understand this in a very virtual, abstract, and non-literal way, which is one of the reasons why the study of Kabbalah is so difficult. It's easier to study the Talmud, where it talks about an ox goring a cow, right? Which are two things which you have in your common experience, than it is to study this. And it's also why before Kabbalah was really explained, and especially in the works of Chassidus, which explain Kabbalah in a very grounded way, in a very broad way, it was very dangerous to study Kabbalah, and especially before the Arizal, because as you can tell already, just from what I've explained to you in this class, a student who is not ready for this, and who does not understand what the Kabbalists intend, and is not on the same page, could take all of this in the completely wrong direction very easily, right? And start saying God literally has a body, or we should worship the 10 Sefiros because they're one with God, and all sorts of other interesting things that have all happened in history. Each one of these things has happened and has been a thing that people have done, which is why for so many generations Kabbalah was a non-written, largely oral tradition between teachers and students who they knew could handle it. Thankfully for us, the Arizal said it is now a mitzvah to reveal Kabbalah, because the Kabbalah, it's two things. The Kabbalah, on the one hand, Kabbalah has been so sufficiently explained in a precise and way that the regular human mind can understand it, that there's much less room for error. And number two, we are all so much stupider and less spiritually sensitive that it's really not as dangerous as it once was for people who, in earlier generations, who would get much more carried away with spiritual realities in general than we do nowadays, when our spiritual sensitivity and appreciation is incredibly diminished. So, we're just about at time. So let me just finish up the rant on the 10 Sefiros. Of course, the Alter Rebbe says the 10 Sefiros Elyonos, which means the 10 supernal Sefiros. The reason the Alter Rebbe qualifies that and says supernal Elyonos, the higher or the lofty Sefiros, is because in Kabbalah, students of Kabbalah know, they really are not just the 10 Sefiros of Atzilus, which is all I've been describing to you so far, in that highest of worlds, but in fact, every world has its version of the 10 Sefiros, which we discussed in chapter 2, that what makes a reality, a distinct reality, all has to do with the nature of its spheres. So in other words, the reason why the world of Bria contains angels, for example, and the world of Atzilus does not contain angels, for example, is because the world of Atzilus has spheres of a certain quality which are able to receive the divine and receive and appreciate godliness in a certain way. And the next lower world appreciates it in a much lesser way, and so has lesser beings. And so too, through all the worlds, down to our world, of course, our reality also has 10 spheres. So, to summarize just the first 2 lines here of chapter 3 of Tanya, every godly soul is not just the simple core, which is a piece of God, but also has the way in which it, generally speaking, is in the world, right? It has the way that it is, so to speak, in relation to other things. In that sense, every godly soul has 10 faculties, which we have not yet enumerated or discussed in any detail. And those 10 faculties derive from, literally, they are the presence, just as the godly soul itself is the presence of God himself on earth, right? The 10 faculties of the godly soul are the presence on earth of the 10 spheres of Atzilus. They are the reflection and the derived from the 10 supernal spheres, the 10 means by which God relates to and creates all realities outside of himself. Let's put it that way. So the rest of chapter 3, most of the rest of chapter 3 is the enumeration of these 10 and the discussion of each of their natures and what they're for, so to speak. So basically, the rest of this chapter, now you know what's on the topic of discussion for the rest of this chapter, is to get into what are these 10 things, what do they do, what's their function, etc. So we'll continue with that, God willing, next week. Or, not probably next week, God willing. Have a kosher